Chapter 8 of William the Conqueror. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Steve Foreman. William the Conqueror by Jack Abbott. Chapter 8. The messenger who brought William the tidings of Harold's ascension to the throne was a man named Tostig, Harold's brother. Though he was Harold's brother, he was still his bitterest enemy. Brothers are seldom friends in families where there is a crown to be contended for. There were, of course, no public modes of communicating intelligence in those days, and Tostig had learned the facts of Edward's death and Harold's coronation through spies, which he had stationed at certain points on the coast. He was himself at that time on the continent. He rode with all speed to Rouen to communicate the news to William, eager to incite him to commence hostilities against his brother. William receiving Tostig's tidings. When Tostig arrived at Rouen, William was in a park which lay in the vicinity of the city, trying a new bow that had been recently made for him. William was a man of prodigious muscular strength, and they gave him the credit of being able to use easily a bow which nobody else could bend. A part of this credit was doubtless due to the etiquette which in royal palaces and grounds leads all sensible courtiers to take good care never to succeed in attempts to excel the king. But notwithstanding this consideration, there is no doubt that the Duke really merited a great portion of the commendation that he received for his strength and dexterity in the new use of the bow. It was a weapon in which he took great interest. A new one had been made for him, of great elasticity and strength, and he had gone out into the park with his officers to try its powers when Tostig arrived. Tostig followed him to the palace, and there advancing to his side, communicated the tidings to him privately. William was greatly moved by the intelligence. His arrow dropped upon the ground. He gave the bow to an attendant. He stood for a time speechless, tying and untying the cordon of his cloak in his abstraction. Presently he began slowly to move away from the place, and to return towards the city. His attendants followed him in silence, wondering what the exciting tidings could be which had produced so sudden and powerful an effect. William went to the castle hall, and walked to and fro for a long time, thoughtfully and evidently agitated. His attendants waited in silence, afraid to speak to him. Rumors began at length to circulate among them in respect to the nature of the intelligence which had been received. At length a great officer of state named Fitzosborne arrived at the castle. As he passed through the courtyard and gates, the attendants and the people, knowing that he possessed in a great degree the confidence of his sovereign, asked him what the tidings were that had made such an impression. "I know nothing about it," he said, "but I will soon learn." So saying, he advanced toward William, and accosted him by saying, "Why should you conceal from us your news?" "It is reported in the city that the King of England is dead, and that Harold has violated his oaths to you, and has seized the kingdom. Is this true?" William acknowledged that that was the intelligence by which he had been so vexed and chagrined. Fitzosborne urged the Duke not to allow such events to depress or dispirit him. "As for the death of Edward," he said, "that is an event past and sure, but cannot be recalled. But Harold's usurpation and treachery admits of very easy remedy. You have the right to the throne, and you have the soldiers necessary to enforce that right. Undertake the enterprise boldly. You will be sure to succeed." William revolved the subject in his mind for a few days, during which the exasperation and anger which the first receipt of the intelligence had produced upon him was succeeded by calm but indignant deliberation in respect to the course which he should pursue. He concluded to call a great council of state, and to lay the ease before them, not for the purpose of obtaining their advice, but to call their attention to the crisis in a formal and solemn manner, and to prepare them to act in concert in the subsequent measures to be pursued. The result of the deliberations of this council, guided doubtless by William's own designs, was that the first step should be to send an emissary to Harold to demand of him the fulfillment of his promises. The messenger was accordingly dispatched. He proceeded to London, and laid before Harold the communication with which he had been entrusted. This communication recounted the 3 promises which Harold had made, namely, to send his daughter to Normandy to be married to one of William's generals, to marry William's daughter himself, and to maintain William's claims to the English crown on the death of Edward. He was to remind Harold also of the solemnity with which he had bound himself to fulfill these obligations by oaths taken in the presence of the most sacred relics of the Church and in the most public and deliberate manner. Harold replied, 1. That as to sending over his daughter to be married to one of William's generals, he could not do it, for his daughter was dead. He presumed, he said, that William did not wish him to send the corpse. 2. In respect to marrying William's daughter, to whom he had been affianced in Normandy, he was sorry to say that was also out of his power, as he could not take a foreign wife without the consent of his people, which he was confident would never be given. Besides, he was already married, he said, to a Saxon lady of his own dominions. 3. In regard to the kingdom, it did not depend upon him, he said, to decide who should rule over England as Edward's successor, but upon the will of Edward himself and upon the English people. The English barons and nobles had decided, with Edward's concurrence, that he, Harold, was their legitimate and proper sovereign, and that it was not for him to controvert their will. However, much as he might be disposed to comply with William's wishes and to keep his promise, it was plain that it was out of his power, for in promising him the English crown, he had promised what it did not belong to him to give. 4. As to his oaths, he said that, notwithstanding the secret presence of the sacred relics under the cloth of gold, he considered them as of no binding force upon his conscience, for he was constrained to take them as only means of escaping from duress in which he was virtually held in Normandy. Promises and oaths, even when extorted by necessity, were null and void. The messenger returned to Normandy with these replies, and William immediately began to prepare for war. His first measure was to call a council of his most confidential friends and advisers, and to lay the subject before them. They cordially approved of the plan of an invasion of England, and promised to cooperate in the accomplishment of it to their utmost of power. The next step was to call a general council of all the chieftains and nobles of the land, and also the notables, as they were called, or principal officers and municipal authorities of the town. The main point of interest for the consideration of this assembly was, whether the country would submit to the necessary taxation for raising the necessary funds. William had ample power, as a duke, to decide upon the invasion and to undertake it. He could also, without much difficulty, raise the necessary number of men, for every baron in the realm was bound, by the feudal conditions on which he held his land, to furnish his quota of men for any military enterprise in which his sovereign might see fit to engage. But for so distant and vast an undertaking as this, William needed a much larger supply of funds than were usually required in the wars of those days. For raising such large supplies, the political institutions of the Middle Ages had not made any adequate provision. Governments then had no power of taxation, like that so freely exercised in modern times, and even now taxes in France and England take the form of grants from the people to the kings. And as to the contrivance so exceedingly ingenious by which inexhaustible resources are open to governments at the present day, that is, the plan of borrowing the money and leaving posterity to pay or repudiate the debt as they please, no minister of finance had, in William's day, been brilliant enough to discover it. Thus each ruler had to rely